Ladies and gentlemen, my fellow feathers in arms, welcome back to The Rabbit Holes That Quack, episode number 7. You're mostly related to today's documentary, The Donut King Podcast. I am one of your hosts, Brandan Jones, and joining me downstream on this adventure, the woman, the myth, a quack who doesn't run on Dungan, Miss Nicole Matthews.
Hello, listeners.
And if you're just joining us well into the future or in near real time, welcome. This is a podcast where Nicole and I subject ourselves to a random documentary each week and let that be the springboard for a larger conversation about the issues therein. If you'd like to drop a particular documentary into the hat for us to choose from, we'll be choosing them from amongst our patrons at patreon.com/Pandora's Quack, where you can also submit broader topics, comments, and questions for both this and our other sister podcasts, such as The Theories That Quack, where co-host Wade Slicken and I dive deep into movie trends past, present, and future to predict where we believe this storytelling medium we love is headed, as well as The Conversations That Quack, where co-host Ephraim Garcia and I do a weekly deep dive into the issues facing the Black movie protagonist. But if joining the Patreon is not in the cards for you right now, that's more than okay. Feel free to share, rate, and review us on the free podcasting service of your choice, and stick around for Pandora's Quack's other upcoming shows. And so, listeners, my fellow feathers in arms, without further ado, these are the rabbit holes that quack. Tonight's featured documentary is The Donut King. The Donut King tells Ted Noy's story that is one of fate, love, survival, hard knocks, and redemption. It was written and directed by Alice Gu, for whom this is her one and only documentary, but apparently is fairly active as a cinematographer. Shares writing credit on The Donut King is Carol Mattori, whose credits include Ghost of the Republic, Bethany Hamilton, Unstoppable, and What We Started. And as of this recording, listeners, The Donut King currently sits at a 97% critical Rotten Tomatoes rating with a 90% audience score. So, listeners, last week we dove headfirst to the conversation around startups in Silicon Valley and why someone like Elizabeth Holmes can become the chosen one the prophecy told us about with her company Theranos and her allegedly groundbreaking technology. But that's not, well, rather, that's where last week began. But where it ended was with me calling Nicole out about her affinity for donuts to see if this California native knew the history of one of her favorite pastries. And I'm going to suspect you had very little idea this is how far down the rabbit hole, drum snare went.
Yeah, I had no idea what we were getting ourselves into with this one. I think when you mentioned it was a donut documentary, I was thinking of something slightly more superficial.
Yeah, I actually feel like this movie opened my eyes quite a bit to almost every small business that's dominated by a particular demographic of people. I never really stopped to think about why that was. And I think, why is this demographic in this particular area, or why corporate America seems to be unable to be like in this kind of like 10 square blocks versus that square blocks. So this documentary definitely has kind of put that thought into my head, which is pretty cool. Were you aware of the donut scene kind of growing up in California? Were you aware of the pink box that they kind of mention, or kind of that donuts seemingly in California were kind of dominated by kind of the Cambodian sort of people?
Yes, I think that kind of to your point, I agree that was something that this documentary unearthed for me. I think in addition to that, being a California native, this opened my eyes to just so many different things related to donuts. I grew up in a town with both a Winchell's and a Christie's Donuts. So for me, this documentary blew me away just on the most fundamental level of just the context of the donut shops that I grew up going to, or asking my father to go to, rather, because let's be real, we never actually did that ourselves. He was a great dad that would run and get exactly what we would want from the donut shop and bring it back to us. But I think, there was a line in the documentary, I think, that really put it best, which I think it was the food and culture editor that said, growing up in California, he knew in kind of a naive way that every mom and pop donut owner was Asian. That definitely hit for me for sure. I think that there was this sort of awareness, but I think I understand what he means, that you knew it in kind of a naive way and that you didn't understand why that was or the reason behind it, or even the reason that the Winchell's donut box was white and when you went to the mom and pop place, it was pink. So just a lot of things that for me were very brand new for something that is actually very old in my life.
Yeah, it's interesting because growing up in suburban Cincinnati, it was only in looking back on that time that I realized how seriously the region took its chili dogs. But there was a regional chain that I loved versus a mom and pop that, had chili dogs as sort of its premier food. And then similarly in Chicago, obviously has its, hands in the hot dog scene, where I got to dive into like bratwurst and just all sorts of hot dog like combinations, including the infamous Chicago style hot dog. And then it was, again, only much, much later that I sort of got a chance to experience Chicago deep dish pizza. Similarly, Atlanta has barbecue and Southern cooking and sweet tea, but like I don't think I ever associated that with, going out and actually picking that up from someplace, mostly with just family. And then, of course, being in New York now, the battle for the best pizza slice will wage on forever. And I feel like the only thing most pizza aficionados in New York can agree on is that you have to eat it by folding it. But beyond that, I think everyone disagrees by this corner, that corner, this corner. As far as who has the best, so the city will forever be deadlocked in that debate. We'll see what Andrew Yang does. I'm sure he's going to kind of stumble into that argument inadvertently, and he'll trend again.
I never understand that argument because there's different pizza for different moods, man.
Yeah.
I never get it. I mean, sometimes you want Roberta's, sometimes you want a dollar slice, sometimes you want, you know what I mean? Like, it just depends on the mood you're in.
I think it's probably, there's a comment probably, because I would say this with coffee, there's objectively, oh, this is probably the best coffee I've had. And then there's, oh, I prefer this coffee. And I think probably that nuance is missed in the pizza community because like everyone kind of obviously looks at the 99-cent slice as this is just sustenance. I'm hungry and I just need something. But when you start kind of going up the chain, then everybody's neighborhood, whatever, has the best. And it kind of then turns into that like, oh, it's just the pizza you grew up on. But as I said, there's probably like infinite top tens on like Thrillist and all these places where they're like, oh, this is the place to go to. We'll see what happens post-pandemic, actually, if any of these, how many survived and then how many will pop up brand new. So you mentioned earlier, you kind of went into this with a little bit of thinking it was going to be sort of a different type of history. So you kind of obviously saw this. Were you expecting more, call it history of the donuts, more this is how it got to America, that kind of history, as opposed to, hey, that store that you've probably been eating donuts at for, your childhood actually has a pretty interesting story about how that even came to be?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's what I mean when I say like I expected it to be more superficial or maybe just more focused, I guess, to your point, on the creation of the donut itself. I think I was pleasantly surprised to see that it was really more of a story about this guy that, came here from Cambodia and was able to, not just create, wealth for his family, but for lots of other families as well. And I think just, again, really being thrown for a loop just because some of the personal connections. I think, moving to the East Coast, that was the first time I really encountered Dunkin' Donuts. And I remember kind of eating them and thinking to myself, like, why wasn't this something that I'd ever, encountered before? And I actually remember that I asked my dad about it. Like, do you know Dunkin' Donuts? Like, why do we not have this? And I think to kind of watch this documentary and find out that the reason is kind of because of this man, I was really kind of shell-shocked by that. But also, I still cannot stand Dunkin' Donuts. So for me, I'm kind of grateful that I grew up on these mom and pop donuts that I think are just so much better.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was always the when at the peak of Dunkin' Donuts, kind of throwing elbows when Starbucks was basically multiplying everywhere. I was always Dunkin' Donuts has the better coffee, but Starbucks has the better food. But yeah, the mom and pop thing just never really was a part of anywhere that I had been growing up. So again, it was interesting that this was all sort of happening in the background, if you will, of the California scene. Yeah, similarly, I definitely misread this. I think I like skimmed one of the things listeners kind of cue you and try to go in cold for all of our shows as much as possible, even if we're rewatching something. I don't like to rewatch stuff that's like, even if it's a couple years kind of fresh in my mind. I like to really just sort of see it for fresh eyes. For instance, if you check out Ephraim and I's most recent podcast, we talked about Blade. And neither one of us had seen that probably in like 10 or 12 years. So it was kind of really cool to see that and to kind of just have 2021 eyes looking back on a 1998, 1999 film. So, but yeah, totally misread this. I thought it was going to be more about like the history of the donut, maybe even like why there's a donut hole, of which I have known and not known and known and not known over the course of my life. I think it's actually like a really like simple story that I feel like I saw like a Donald Duck PSA of like why that was as a kid. But it was, as I said, it was interesting to learn more about why these demographics just in general tend to dominate sort of a particular type of store or shop or restaurant in that kind of area. So
you didn't encounter Dunkin' Donuts though, because I think they did show Dunkin' Donuts had East Coast to kind of Midwest-ish coverage. So is that like a thing that you remember?
I just didn't really drink coffee until college. Like it was around.
But I mean for the donuts, like as a kid, like do you have memories of like, going to donut shops to like pick out a donut?
No, that was totally either somewhere wherever we were going had them, or that was like a store, like the grocery store had just like a dozen or something like that. But I don't recall like going to a place to actually get them. And even my parents, like my mom, I like always have memories of making coffee. It was like extremely rare that I can even like imagine her going someplace. She had coffee when we were at a restaurant, like after dinner. It's a very old people thing, sort of as tradition. But yeah, there was just that whole coffee donut culture was just not something they did. Now that's actually, I will say, I think my dad was much more into that scene. As one of the documentary kind of pointed out, how it kind of came about of people having to sort of just be on the go. And so that just kind of became the default food of just, I have to kind of eat something quickly because I have a really long commute. I do kind of like, my dad was much more of the pastries person. But he was like apple turnover, apple this. That's just like his, he loves like pretty much the combination of like apple and anything. But yeah, just hardcore donuts being gotten from a store. Those memories are extremely far and few in between, if they're kind of there at all.
It's so interesting. Yeah. I think like that to me was one of the things that I thought this documentary did a good job of reflecting, is how like ingrained these stores were in the communities and like families that would like come for like decades. And it did make me think of the Christie's in the town that I grew up in, because I think it definitely was a place that you would kind of go to, over the years, right? Like it would just become this sort of ingrained part of like your routine or, so anyways, it's interesting how it kind of varies geographically.
Yeah, it would almost be maybe as a follow-up thing to see what happens in the Midwest. Listeners, if any of you have kind of donut pastry kind of stories from that era, because I kind of liken it to a certain degree of like sweet tea not really being pervasive in the rest of the country, but being very much a East and sort of South type of thing, especially like with how sweet it is. It's almost just like sugar water. And then the further north and the further west, they had iced tea and you could add sugar yourself. But the way that it was just sort of inextricable in the South is very, very regional. So I can imagine if this is kind of how the California scene was operating as far as donuts, clearly there's mom and pop shops everywhere, but taking over the way that Ted Noy was able to do is probably very specific to California, which is pretty cool.
For sure.
And so with that, what did you think about the documentary as a film? Did Alice Gu's portrayal of the Donut King and his story seem fair? Did it seem biased? Did everybody live happily ever after?
Well, I don't know if I want to like completely spoil the ending. But no, I mean, I was, I think, again, pleasantly surprised and sort of blown away by certain aspects of this documentary. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think it deserves its Rotten Tomato rating for sure. I would agree with that. I think it just, it's more than just being, I think, unexpected going in. I think it is the fact that this was something that to me was completely unknown. And I do think it's an important part of American history, even if it's about donuts, right? Like, I think it's something that it's good for everyone to be educated about for a number of reasons. I think for me personally, one of the biggest takeaways from the documentary and something that made me really emotional, actually, is just that to me, it was sort of like a glimpse of an America that was. I think I was not expecting, even when I realized it was about this gentleman, that we were still going to get such a deep dive into his life and into how he actually ended up in America. And I think the telling of that story really resonated with me because, we are going through a lot of really large immigration issues and discussions in our country right now. And I think for me, just sort of seeing that we, took all of these refugees in, and that it was something that was really kind of praised and talked about, not just from conservatives, but like liberals as well. It just kind of warmed my heart a little bit, and reminded me, what at least I believe America was supposed to be about and should be about, and that I think we've sort of strayed from in certain aspects. And I think that when you hear a story like this, my hope would be that it would help reframe for certain people, the importance of still being open about how we approach immigration. Because these people were able to come here and make beautiful lives and become part of our communities, loved part of our communities. And I just think that's something that was good to reflect upon and was really unexpected for me in watching this.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear stories like this because, the sort of rise, rags to riches stories are kind of usually a dime a dozen. But I think what I kind of jump on what you're saying, I do miss that people used to think like this. Like when you're hearing Ted talk about, just sort of a story from just the very beginning, kind of through the end, just that they could see an opportunity plain as day and work really hard to achieve it. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day about, just there's a lot of stagnation just in just almost every industry currently. And it seems like a lot of people are just sort of sitting around to see who's going to do something groundbreaking next so that they can all copy it and monetize it to death. And I think what I really appreciated about this documentary is how Ted Noy actually had quite a bit to legitimately overcome, including like the fall of a city in Cambodia and like how do you actually make it to the States with such a large family and sort of the sponsorship sort of mechanics, how to make money, and then of course how to take what he learned and turn it into something that, as we kind of mentioned before, just was keeping Dunkin' Donuts kind of out of California, or at least out of that region, for a really long time. And so it's interesting because it is, I think they kind of had the clip of just sort of, there was a little bit of mirroring today's kind of conversation about immigration, but just like back then it was kind of like, no, this is who we are, this is what we're doing, and just kind of just very at least as portrayed by the documentary. I'm sure there's a lot of nuances in the papers and a lot of, dinner table conversations, but just like a very definitive, hey, this is what America is, this is what it stands for, and this is what we're going to do in response to this global conflict, like, our moral obligation to kind of do something. And so it was interesting to kind of see the other side of that and have, America be that beacon that a lot of people, I think, nowadays kind of talk about that we used to be. And then to kind of take that and personalize it with Ted's story about how he was able to sort of just get here. Like, I just need to get out of this situation and just have this dream of coming to America, and could have done anything, could have been anything. I think they said like janitor was one of his jobs, custodian at the church, and a few others just sort of throwaway jobs. But then, as I said, he just was someone that just saw the opportunity and then just really just went after it. And that's something I think is just kind of very culturally just isn't as talked about as it was today. And I think, there's obviously kind of like a, we'll see if we can kind of find a documentary that dives into, the financial crisis and just sort of what's going on with millennials and kind of, the kind of constant conversation about generational, millennials having facing multiple once in a generation sort of catastrophes. But it's just interesting how there's just this gap of time between now and then, again, to just have like someone who just thought, hey, I just need to figure out how to do this, and then can go from, having a family of like a dozen people and having like nothing, and then just kind of like rising up and what he did and what he was able to build that I think still has a lasting impact in California.
Yeah, I mean, I think to your point too, like that was another thing that struck me. It wasn't just how much conviction we had, I think, like as a country in bringing them here. I think on top of that, it was how they were treated once they were here. And I think you and I have talked about this, but it's like, I believe in a dangerous way we are like progressing towards a very individual society in terms of like we're very focused on ourselves and our immediate family and this sense of kind of like it's kind of like the Hunger Games out there a little bit. And I think it can feel that way for a lot of people. And I think that because it's become harder to live in our country, people start to reject community in certain ways. And I think that was really impressive to see that just like, again, this church like sponsored them, took them in, invited them over, had them over for barbecue, like that stuff too, just kind of like, it did make me emotional, I'll be honest, while watching this documentary, just because I just don't hear stories like that as much anymore. And I think that that sense of community, it's not to say it's not still present in the United States, it is for sure, and I think in certain pockets, but I do think that overall we are kind of losing that and that willingness to kind of reach out and help one another. I think it's becoming harder and harder to do that because people are so focused on trying to take care of their own.
Well, I think it's the, the sort of proverb, once bitten, twice shy sort of thing. I think you brought this up talking off air kind of at some point in the last year when we had watched the Mr. Rogers documentary. And I think even in that documentary, they talk about, could a Mr. Rogers exist today? And they're like, probably not, because that guy who is so genuinely nice would seem creepy. Like there would have to be some sort of dark skeleton in his closet for him to be that nice, as opposed to Mr. Rogers, who just was genuinely a good guy. And I think probably what's happening is you're no longer seeing people acting on just pure moral steam. There's kind of a, what can I get out of this? And like, again, like we should try to see if we can find some documentaries, and listeners definitely recommend some to us that kind of like dive into just like those like paradigm shifts in America and really just in society. But I think we just reached a point where people were just who offered up, this or that, or kind of were nice, or this kind of just got bitten too much. And then I think that just kind of became the protect yourself as opposed to expose yourself. And if you kind of get hurt, that's okay, because at least you kind of got hurt trying to do the right thing. And I think that's probably become very, very muddied. And again, when you kind of look back on this, which I'm kind of forgetting, I think it was like the 70s, if I'm remembering correctly. I say that because of the way that the pictures looked. It feels like it was like 70s. I just think that like during that time, especially with sort of Vietnam kind of around and all that kind of stuff, I think there was a little bit more of sort of just I won't call it unity, but I would just call I will say that we were less fragmented due to like culture back then. And that's that's just kind of like how things were. But as I said, it's kind of interesting to kind of see how all of that was just sort of like playing out in the documentary, and so that he was able to sort of build what he was able to build. Because I think that would be extremely difficult to do now for a variety of reasons, especially kind of being sponsored by a family, especially at like as many people as got sponsored kind of through that program. I think it's probably extremely rare now.
Yeah. I mean, I do still think it's a little bit like what we choose to value in society, though. And I think that like that is clearly a shift that's occurred. I mean, you can take like even some of the clips they showed. I think it was like Rosalind Carter or whoever who was like, speaking at the camp. And I think it's like, if you think back to that time period of like, that was something that, was looked up to, like a woman that was like, stood for a social cause or something like that. And I think sometimes you just look around today and it's like, okay, who is the woman that like a lot of women look up to in our society? And it's like, Kim Kardashian, who also is trying to do things socially. I'm sorry, I have to say that. But still, I think it's people that are mostly prized for, their looks, right? And so I think that that's a part of it, too. We've just kind of shifted away from it being in vogue to, support your community and support social causes.
Well, I also think there's probably until cancel culture, I I don't want to say like dies, but until we just as a society kind of shift away from that paradigm, I think you're just not going to see these people kind of come forward, because both with like Me Too and with some of the things that happened sort of last year and just sort of the ongoing nature of, at some point someone finds something that they disagree with, and it may be something that's completely valid to disagree with, that may be egregious or disgusting or name your ism or your ist, and because of that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, they're no longer able to act on someone's behalf or in addition to, you know, whatever kind of in that present. Like, for instance, one of the things that, you know, Ethan and I talked a little bit about, but I just kind of been having an ongoing conversation with a few friends, is just this controversy over In the Heights, and just sort of this idea that because it doesn't have one or two more people represented in it, that it then must sort of be an omission that's purposeful. And so like Lin-Manuel had to come out and apologize, and apparently Gina Torres is not black, she's Latin, which I was like having a good laugh with a friend of mine about, and I was like, I had no idea, and she was like, I had no idea. But it's like all these sort of like conversations about it, and it's just sort of like, what happened to just watching a great movie? Because by all accounts, like, people are just like, this is actually a really fun movie. It's really good. It's a feel-good movie. It's the right movie people want to watch right now. And instead, that opening weekend, it was kind of mired in this conversation about like, oh, what is the deal about kind of going against these sort of Afro-Latinos? And so then you have to think about, all right, well, then the next time, what if someone was kind of like, oh, I've seen the trailers for In the Heights. Like, I really want to like make my version of that story. This is a great opportunity. They now see all of this sort of controversy about, oh, well, I didn't really cast these people. Why didn't you cast these people? And now that person maybe gets shy. And so then when you kind of bring it back to people's ability to kind of have these like moral high grounds, if you will, but perhaps having a very troubled past to sort of arrive at that conclusion, I think right now society is not ready to sort of handle those two things. It's kind of like the thing I always kind of say to you and kind of a few other people, where I'm like, that woman can be a monster, but she can be a great mother too. And like, we have a really hard time as a society being like, those two things can be in the same human being. It's either you're a perfect person all the time or you're a monster all the time. And so like, I think it makes sense what you're talking about. And I think that's the ideal. And that's kind of what we need to like strive for and to get back to. But I think right now there are probably genuinely good people that are just scared of all the things I'm talking about, just kind of like coming to like bite them, that they might not even be aware of. They may have just said something in passing that can be taken out of context, which is why I actually think Beyonce has kind of endured as this like ethereal entity, because she doesn't say anything. She kind of just is like, cool, here's my performance and I'm out, sort of thing. So there's nothing to pick apart. There's nothing to be like, well, she doesn't care about these people, or she doesn't care about these people, or why does she hate these people? It's just, here's my music. Now I'm going to go hide again. And I think that's kind of why, to a certain degree, some of these people, I don't know how much Kim Kardashian lives out loud anymore, since she started to kind of do her stuff and the show's kind of ended. But like, that's something, again, like if she was just very loose online, you're seeing this with Chrissy Teigen even, about how it's just like, you kind of just went too far for too long, too loud. And someone finally was like, wait a minute, let me like scroll through. Okay, here you go. Why are you doing this? And now she's in a whole world of madness now.
Yeah, no, I agree with you about the Beyonce thing. I think the funny thing is I don't believe that was probably the initial reason, but I think that's the effect of that. I think the initial reason was because she was terrible in interviews.
Yeah, I think she just didn't
but
like
I think
it.
now, to your point, over time, it's definitely worked to her advantage. There's nothing out there.
Yeah, there's no video. There's no weird thing about someone being like, oh, hey, Beyonce, you singer, what do you think about, you know, this blah, blah, blah genocide? And then she just says one wrong thing, and that just follows her around for 20 years. Like, she's just, you know, she's just tucked away. I think the other thing that was like really interesting about this documentary is like, you know, kind of speaking about generational stuff, is like, this is one of the few times, and this is skipping ahead a little bit, but just one of the few times that we actually see this transition from sort of a founding generation to the next generation. And I thought it was cool because, you know, when we see this fictionalized, it's always the younger generation coming in and just kind of like wrecking things, or doing something that's like a little bit too neon, or a little bit too this, or a little bit too that, or just kind of not respecting their elders and kind of blowing it up and blah, 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 blah. And I thought what was really interesting is kind of, at least with the families they portrayed here, it was like, the founding generation was kind of still there. They were still kind of, hey, like, this is how you make great donuts. This is how you make great, like, food. And here's the care and here's the craft and yada, yada. And then watching the younger generation be like, cool, like, I'm not going to take that away from you. I just want to build on it. And so the son who basically said that he was looking at things from a, inspirational level, finding new muses and kind of having the emojis and all these things kind of be represented as donuts. And then like the daughter from sort of the other family using social media and like all these types of things and like having sort of these very just sort of outreach kind of vibes. I just thought that was really interesting because you don't really see that overlap very often. And it was cool to see that. It makes sense. Like if this is all very family driven, if this is all very much, this is our community, this is our culture, and we're kind of passing this down. I thought that was kind of cool to see. And even sort of the acknowledgement that the younger generation wasn't expecting to kind of be within the family business, but once they were there, they were able to like make it their own. And now they are sort of like having fun and they've kind of made it, this thing that they actually really do enjoy.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it was really cool to see. I mean, they did also acknowledge that a lot of them aren't carrying on their parents' businesses and how like they've become a victim of their own success. So I think that part made me sad because I actually did feel like they probably struggled to spotlight some of the kids because to me, it seemed like there were only two and that there were more like donut shop owners that we got to see.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that was like a true reflection of the current landscape, but it kind of makes sense, I think like why they wouldn't want to continue on just given how much hard work it is, and I think they did a really great job of kind of portraying that just kind of throughout the whole documentary, really, in terms of like the hours that you have to work to keep up a donut shop, all of the like skill and technique around the baking. That part was actually really fascinating as well. Just that like, these aren't just like, okay, mom and pop shops. Like these are mom and pop shops that require a lot of time and energy to run successfully. And so I do think, when you think about like your average, 25-year-old today, like in my mind, most of them are not people that could probably run small businesses like this. And so I do think that was really impressive to see with the folks that they included. And to your point, just like some of the clever marketing ideas, like the cronut thing was like crazy. That girl was so clever to do that. I was cracking up about Thrillist because I think I've definitely mentioned Thrillist to my parents. So that was making me laugh when her mom was like, Thrillist? But I thought that was really cool.
I think I actually do remember, obviously remember the New York cronut, but I do remember that like faux lawsuit. I had kind of totally forgotten what had happened with that. So it was cool to actually see the conclusion of like, oh, it's just a croissant into this? Oh, okay. And then she just sort of like, clearly she'd been making donuts long enough to figure out how to do it or to kind of make it her own. And so it's amusing that like there is this controversy over, oh, she stole the recipe. Like, how is she doing this kind of thing? When in reality, it's not, unless you're legitimately, like even I think like the joke with like McDonald's like special sauce or something like that is only like, it's like actual over-the-counter condiments that I think are just like mixed in a particular way. So it's like stuff like that where it's like I can understand the like litigiousness of it, but at the same time I'm also just like, yeah, I would probably argue you shouldn't be able to call it a cronut, like that's fine, but like beyond that it's like I feel like someone has probably accidentally made a cronut long before the chef in New York kind of made it, and then made it a thing where I remember people at the office were just like, oh, we're gonna go like wait in line for this cronut, and they'd be gone for like 3 hours and then like finally come back and be like, oh yeah, we got one, and we're like, where have you been? We're like, in line. So all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, obviously they glossed over it so that they could kind of reveal to you what happened. But I think when they initially started talking about it, it didn't hit me as something that was going to end up being a problem, I think, because I did just assume, oh, I'm sure she just put something together that was like similar, right? Like, that's what I thought was kind of odd about it. It's not like I think he would have been publishing his recipes at the time. So I was pleased to see that wasn't a lasting issue for her.
Yeah. The thing that was kind of interesting, and I kind of kept, it was like a gnawing at the back of my head a little bit, and then they finally, acknowledge it in the documentary, and it's actually become a, it's sort of how the documentary sort of ends, if you will. I absolutely did not see Ted's sort of downfall, if you will, coming. And it was kind of one of those things where like, I remember when I think he was like walking into the house, And he was like, oh, like I missed this house. And like, that was, I remember just kind of thinking, oh, that's interesting. Like, I was like, I wonder if he just was like, retired to a whatever home and like, blah, blah, blah. Cause they interview like his kids and all that kind of stuff. And I was kind of like, oh, I wonder what, and then like, that's when they started to actually like go into it. And it was interesting because it's like, of all things, which again is kind of, amusing because nowadays it's always drugs. It's always drugs. And with this, it was gambling. And it's interesting because it's like, I think you were the first one that sort of clued me in about how accessible Vegas is for people who live in California, sort of in that way, because living in Georgia and really just being on the East Coast, we just always went to Florida, just like everywhere in Florida, just most often. So it was like this, like, it's almost like the advent of the highway that fueled, the urban sprawl that they talk about in, the documentary, made it a necessity to sort of figure out how to, eat on the go, like I mentioned before, and just may have also been the catalyst for how easy it was for him to dip his toe into Vegas and then eventually start to lose his grip. And I know I've talked to you about this before, but, for the sake of the listeners, one of the things I remember, since you've brought up Kim Ye, I will go with the Ye. Kanye, I remember saying years ago, like years and years ago on the Tonight Show with Jay Leno, I think he was like 28 or something like that. And Leno kind of like was talking to him about just like all the crazy things that he had done like to that point. And Leno was just kind of like, why are you doing this? And, to paraphrase, Kanye basically was just like, I've done everything I ever dreamed of doing. And so now I have to like push myself to do things that I can't even imagine doing just so that he can essentially stay engaged. And when you think about Ted, he leaves this like life where, he's in Cambodia and just the city is just coming apart. It's, he's basically pushed out sort of by his elders of like, the city's about to fall. We don't know what's going to happen here. Just get out, get out, get out. And so he gets out and, barely has anything to his name and just going through just like, whatever kind of impoverished story after impoverished, like cliche after impoverished sort of cliche, and finally digs himself out via like actual hard work and actually kind of recognizing the world around him and how to work with it and living by all means the American dream. And then he did it. Like he actually, like he did it. He's a multimillionaire. He has all of these other families that he was able to sort of bring in with him and sponsor them the way that he kind of came up. He built this community. He did all of these things. And I can imagine it's kind of like, well, what are you supposed to do next? Like there's this goal, there's ambition that you have in your mind of what you're trying to sort of strive towards. And when you hit it, you kind of need something else to stay engaged with. And unfortunately, kind of for him, it just turned out to be like gambling. And won't go too far into the details of that, again, for folks who haven't seen it. But it was interesting to sort of hear that and to kind of see that. Sad, of course, but just sort of, I was not expecting that. But then obviously it kind of makes sense. But it was just, again, because of the close proximity of sort of Vegas and just kind of advent of highways and all that stuff. It's just interesting to kind of see that's how that story started to end.
So I definitely knew from the beginning. I think like I knew because of the way that the wife interviews were separated.
Yeah.
That to me was kind of like a tell. And then when he was in the house, it just looked like no one lived there, which I thought was kind of interesting as well.
Yeah. Well, I would have figured he just, that could have been one of those things where he's just dead kind of thing, where it's just like, she's doing the interview and they like caught up with him. And then you see the nice thing that we always say that we actually haven't gotten really at the end. I think only one documentary had it where they did the like, the title cards of this is what happened. And 2 years later, this happened. But most of the documentaries we've been watching have actually been taking place in the last couple of years. So that's why. But yeah.
Well, so what was funny is like, I actually thought it was going to be something that like he had an affair because to me, it was just clear from the beginning, like he didn't live in the house. Cause I was like, that house looks too pristine. Like no one lives there. And then because of the interview being separate with his wife, I was like, okay, maybe he just like cheated on her, whatever. The Vegas thing kind of threw me. But to your point, like, it did make me laugh because Vegas was really kind of experiencing like a big boom during that time period, So it was not just because of the proximity, but I think also because of the marketing that they were doing. It was a big destination for not just, single people, but for families. So I thought that was really funny how he was talking about like bringing his kids there and, the life that he was able to kind of lead as like a high roller and all of that. It was definitely very unexpected, but the timing of it definitely matched up as like something that they probably would have been doing to kind of get away from California for the weekend or for a few days or whatever. But yeah, I was not really expecting it to be as serious as it was, or that he would, I think really to me, the most shocking thing of it all was just sort of the conclusion and the result, and the decision that they made to go back. Like that really surprised me.
Yeah, I almost wonder if that was he has a little bit of money left and it just sort of made sense to go back. I can't remember if he said that he still had family there. But it probably also was one of those things where there's some familiarity in the novelty of knowing that you had to leave. And then the story of just all of the people just being ushered out of that city and just sort of all the fallout, kind of global fallout of what was going on in Cambodia, and then kind of going back, and the city is different. It's back to bustling, but it's very different. He's probably just, reflective on his years, because it's almost like why stay in America. The point of America was sort of to get away from what was almost this inevitable impending doom. And now that he sort of accomplished everything that he set out to do in America, and his kids are here, and he kind of can look kindly on this community that wouldn't be there because of him. It's almost like his job's done here. Like, I don't know. It's weird, but then the more you kind of think about it, it's like, why would you sort of stay there? Like, even if you kind of thought about it as like, what if you were a farmer and went to the city to kind of do things, and you do incredible things in the city, and then eventually, you have a similar story to him. Like, I feel like you would want to go back to the farm. Like, it's like, okay, I'm ready to go back and live a simpler life because I've actually achieved everything that I set out to achieve. That's done. So what else am I supposed to do? Obviously an interesting choice to kind of leave America to go back to where he was from, but I can kind of understand that.
Yeah, I think I think the thing that I wish they maybe would have dug into a little bit more is I do suspect part of it was the shame that he felt, obviously, in that being kind of a last resort. You lose all your money and you're like, okay, I'm just going to go home, right? That's a really natural kind of response. And I think even, I was happy that they were upfront about things that he was, upfront really about things like his affair, and just the fact that what he did was kind of messed up, obviously. But I do think I'm still kind of intrigued as to what really drove that, I guess, if that makes sense. I don't really, and maybe that was just something that obviously he wasn't really comfortable sharing or exploring. But I think that was kind of the one part for me that was a little bit okay, was he just a gambling addict? Was it, because even the fact that he got this second chance to go home and then start over, and then he cheats on his wife, I just would be curious, I guess, to understand him a little bit more in that way.
Yeah, I think it's just it's a cautionary tale, and one of the reasons why, I tell a lot of people, especially had some great sort of conversations with friends over the last year with the pandemic, and I just tell people, I'm just like, you need to find a hobby. And it sounds funny and it sounds silly, and obviously people were making sourdough and all these types of things, but I scream it from the rooftops all the time, and the more complex your hobby, the more complicated, the better. No matter how big or small your dreams are, should you get there over the long, hard road or suddenly, it's just it's the same issue that faces lottery winners. You just suddenly don't have normal people's problems. You only have problems of your own doing. So finding something to do with all that time and energy is sort of crucial. And I think when you're kind of in this position where you've been struggling or fighting to get to a goal, and then you get to that goal, I think your perspective is just very different than other people. And so that's I think what happens is the people who haven't perhaps, lived in your shoes or kind of experienced those types of things just don't understand how your mind has kind of gotten to that conclusion, or how it's sort of gotten to this. And I think if Ted had was a golfer or something like that, he might have just been okay, cool. I'm gonna, I love golfing, so I spent all this money on equipment and I travel the world on every possible course, or any infinite kind of number of things that he could have done. But I think his whole existence was wrapped up in, I have to sort of provide for my family and provide for my community and all those kind of things. And he was able to fortunately take a step back and kind of look and be okay, I've done that. And I think in the absence of what's my next mission, what's my next purpose, I think probably it's likely the world around him wasn't able to then keep up with what he needed. And so like you just kind of start to like fill it with, you know, things that, you know, again, as I said, like usually it ends up being a drug thing where people just kind of like get that little taste, or they get experiment, or they become adrenaline junkies, or this becomes a thing, or that becomes a thing. And so that would be me like speculating on like why I would think just like the psychology of that, of why that happens. Cause I think that's why you have like, you know, to bring Leno back into it, why he has like 100, if not more, cars that are just vintage and he likes fixing them up. It's why you see some of these celebrities that just like are always out of trouble. They're like barely in the news, and then they kind of do like an, you know, here's my Vogue whatever questions, and they just have a garage and they just work on things, or like someone's, you know, always renovating their house or something. I think there's just if you don't have something to fill that time or engage with your energy, I just think there's it's like kind of like how his parents used to say, like, there's nothing good in going on at 2 a.m. Like, if you're not, you know, staying up playing video games, if you're not reading, if you're not whatever, if you're just out in the world and you're like, I'm bored and I have energy and I'm awake, like, that's how tombstones get kicked over. That's how cows get tipped over. That's how, like, houses get egged. That's how, like, toilet paper ends up in trees. But, like, or you could be wherever doing something constructive. So I just think that's kind of, like, probably where all that comes from.
I was very intrigued just by the fact that, you know, when he arrived, he got this training from Winchell's, which ended up being the ultimate competitor. I thought that was another interesting part of the documentary, that they had this training program. The town that I grew up in had a Winchell's, and then also a donut shop that was called Christie's. So now I'm actually curious if there is a link to Ted, being that his initial stores were called Christie's. That would kind of be really funny. But we would go to both of them. I would say we would go to Christie's more than Winchell's. I liked Winchell's for like a very specific reason. It just had like a kind of sweeter tasting chocolate donut. So for me, that was kind of just like every once in a while, I would ask my dad for Winchell's instead of Christie's. But more often than not, Christie's was definitely the spot. And I thought that was just really funny that, you know, essentially they went and taught him this skill and how to do this, and then ended up being, you know, kind of the reason that they were struggling from a business perspective for some years. But I thought it was cool that clearly, you know, there's still some friendly relations there, seeing him go visit the head chef. I thought that was kind of funny, but also just like another interesting part of the story.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very of the time, again, like when you kind of go back to that era, like we were talking about with like morality and people just trying to, you know, the American way being sort of the moral way. I think people were just genuinely, they had competitors for sure back then, but I think they looked at it as like not so much a let me steal your trade secrets or espionage or any of that thing. I think it was like, I can work harder than you and outdo you, like outperform you, out customer you, out, you know, all those types of things. The way that everyone kind of talks now about like, it's great when these two companies are competing because it actually benefits consumers. That's kind of what, you know, the ideal capitalist system is supposed to do. So I just think it's kind of one of those situations, especially because it's like when you think about, like if you're that guy from Winchell's, to a certain degree, you have to just find it amusing, where it's just like, oh, I just took in this random person who could barely speak English, and I just kind of thought it'd be cool to like help him out. And then he ended up almost driving me out of business, you know, a decade later, and became this multimillionaire. And now here we are, like two old men at the end of our lives, just like sharing a donut and a coffee in like a store that neither one of us owns, kind of thing, which is kind of amusing. It's very sort of poetic. But what I will say to that degree is now I will make a prediction that who knows if we'll be able to come back and like listen to this and see. But like, so you have some of these tech companies doing this now. Like Google is basically just like, this is me kind of, you know, assimilating it. I haven't actually like read exactly what they were planning to do, but I believe Google now is like, you don't have to go to college. You can basically come to our program, learn what we do, sort of thing, and just sort of like transition into the company, if you will. It would be interesting now to see if some of these larger tech companies start doing that, and then someone then kind of pulls a TED and goes, oh, actually, I kind of understand how this system works. I might actually be able to build this component of their business much better. And then they kind of spin out, and then that's the next tech race, SiliconValley.com bubble type of thing.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see, but I do endorse these programs. I think that ultimately they are healthy, because I think they take away from the university system. And as we discussed on a previous episode, we all know how I feel about the university system.
Yeah, apprenticeships definitely need to generally come back across almost every possible industry, because I really do think that there needs to be a lot of inexperienced, well-studied blood mixed with very experienced and perhaps out-of-date studied blood. I think that's kind of the only way we're going to have two very practical ideas colliding for the good of everyone.
I think the contributions to the culture, to like your very, very earlier point around the pink box, were surprising as well. It was so gross to me that they were cleaning the stir sticks.
Yeah.
That just made me laugh, but at the same time I understood it. But I think the pink box really has become synonymous with donuts in a way that, you know, when they kind of lined up a lot of those clips, was interesting to see. You know, and I think it kind of, it definitely added to the excitement of it, right? Because it became this like visual clue, I think, where you would see that at, you know, the office or in a home or at church or, you know, wherever people gather. And I think you would get this kind of like, and I still think this happens today, of people going, ooh, donuts, you know, like that is something where I have like lots of memories of that, even in adulthood, mostly, I guess, in an office setting. But it just sort of does. It sends this kind of like shock wave, you know, kind of through around where you are, of like, this exciting thing is now there that you get to eat. And, you know, inside there's going to be a different variety, hopefully, and you can pick which one. So I think small things like that, you know, he was doing for cost savings, it was really interesting to see sort of the lasting effect on, you know, how we kind of look at donuts today.
Yeah, the pink box being cheaper is it's I feel like that's a big brain move, as the kids say. I think that one of the things that's actually would be really interesting to see just regionally, kind of what we talked about before, and just like how pervasive donut culture is throughout the United States, because like any TV show, obviously there's the cop cliche, there's the Homer Simpson sort of cliche, and all these types of things. But when you think about it, all of those ideas are based on, you know, predominantly scripts and stories, no matter where these stories take place, from people who grew up or likely moved to, or just very inherently a part of the culture in California. So it's kind of fascinating to think what the ramifications of that are, because it's like, as someone who grew up on the East Coast, I see the pink box and I don't think anything of it. It's just a box to me. But like, if that story took place in California and they had, say, like a yellow box, you'd be like, oh, that's weird. Like, why are they doing that kind of thing? That must be for a very specific narrative reason. You wouldn't think that like, oh, they just didn't do that or forgot or something like that. And so it's like, those details are just like very California. And so it's interesting. Even I almost would wonder how much of that you could even argue bled into movies that then informed it, because again, like most of the offices I've been in, they're there, but it will kind of be like they're just not as pervasive, whereas like in TV and movies and all these types of things, I just feel like someone's always eating donuts, like in the office or like at this precinct or like at this church or whatever. They're just always present, and I wonder like how much of that was driven by this boom that sort of happened in California with donuts.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like for it to be so prevalent, though, in like movie and TV shows, it had to be happening in more than just California. You know, like that just seems like, because they had like quite a few examples. I was actually surprised. And I'm sure you could go and find even more clips than that. So I don't know. I'd be curious to know. But it was interesting to think that in addition to, you know, some of these surviving donut shops in California, he will sort of survive through time just through the concept of a pink box. I think that's incredible.
Yep, he is the godfather of the donut industry, which is pretty interesting. Just kind of, I actually wonder. I mean, I guess to that point, most of the people, again, through the point of view of the documentary, Winchell's did obviously very well, but I wonder to what degree Winchell's has a cultural impact, the way that the sort of Cambodian culture who sort of took over and transformed the donut culture. Just if Winchell's is going to sort of be relevant. Dunkin' Donuts is almost like, it's not a punchline, but it definitely is. It's there. They've kind of, I think, gotten to a place where they're respected now. But I do remember there was a point where there was kind of like, they were sort of the punchline. And then once Starbucks came up, and then everyone started to like have to like pay attention to their coffee. Dunkin' Donuts is definitely kind of on par with them. And then you see Tim Hortons all the time, the Canadian brothers and sisters spilling down into the East Coast. I'm not sure if there's any more chains. I'm sure there are, but the ones that have that like national mind share, those are the ones I can think of. But there's probably hundreds and hundreds of regional ones, especially like statewide or like townside ones, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that was probably just sort of that ending note of just kind of how, you know, nationally there is a donut craze, and there has been. And I think you do really see that, like, you know, even for me, like with domestic travel, you know, when I like go and research a city, or, you know, you try and go see, okay, like where are the places to eat? There is always a, you know, Instagram kind of worthy donut shop in every town across America. And so I thought that was really interesting, them showing like the donut festival and just sort of the craze. And then even some of the stats, truthfully, like it made me feel better. Like I think they had said the average person eats 3 donuts a month. Which sounds like a lot. And I think there were some other ones at the end where I was just like, that's insane. So I think that part was interesting too, is just like the lens out of like, this is a much larger industry, where, you know, it has kind of become now more focused on unique ways of kind of presenting it and different ingredients. And like, the funny thing for me, truthfully, is like, I really am not a fan of those types of donuts. I'm definitely old school, kind of rooted in the donut shops that they showed in this documentary. Like I still prefer just kind of like glaze, chocolate, whatever. That's not to say I'm not willing to try. I think, as you can vouch for, I do have some pretty interesting donuts delivered here. But, you know, I still like the classics are kind of what I love. But I do think that now the kind of cool thing is some of these ones that they were showing. And it's just sort of crazy to see the possibilities, really, of all the different, you know, like the bacon. And I think like there was the other one that was like the unicorn donut. Like it's just, you kind of realize this could go on forever. So I will be curious to see just kind of like for how long, I guess, that sort of sustains. And I guess if, you know, if it started off with just like the 10 flavors and now we're at, you know, all of these kind of crazy flavors, knowing that this is such an American staple, where will the donut industry be in 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, that may actually directly tie into some of the conversations we've had, and I've had with others about what's going to happen with the work world after this. Because even when I was thinking about the other day, there used to be one of those coffee carts for a couple jobs ago, and I ended up getting my coffee from that guy and kind of getting to know him. And so he'd like see me 3 people deep and then kind of give me the order that I was looking for, chat with him and stuff. And like, I assume he just sort of, you know, it's like a coffee cart feels like one of the most easy, yeah, like everyone will always need this sort of things. And then no one expects the pandemic. So I just wonder kind of obviously what happened to him and what happened to all these like food carts and sort of food trucks and all that kind of stuff over the year, kind of like what those people were able to do to kind of adapt. So if we end up, instead of it being like a 99% people commuting into the city, if it drops to like aggressively like 85% people commuting into the city, it'll be interesting to see kind of what happens with these not only fast casual mom and pops, but like some of these like donut shops and stuff, which, you know, they'll always deliver. But I'd be curious to know, like even the place that you used to Peter Pan's, I think the Greenpoint place, that feels like that probably would have just stayed open, like completely unaffected, kind of do the neighborhood. But like some of these other ones that might be a little bit further out of the way or aren't necessarily in like neighborhoods, they're just kind of actually like purposefully, like this is where the people who come into this office building will walk by. I'd be curious to see sort of what happens with those folks, or if people, you know, will want to spend that kind of money on that stuff. Again, coffee was getting up there already. Donuts generally haven't been too expensive, but they actually talked about that. They were like, donuts used to be like 5 cents or something like that, and now they're like $1.10. Which my dad used to make that joke where I think he did usually go to the actually go to the movies, and it was like 5 or 10 cents, which cracks me up.
Yeah, I guess I wonder just like how long the innovation of it can kind of last, you know? And
Yeah.
I did think a lot about Fake Famous when they were touching on some of the social aspects. But I think that's kind of more what I was getting at is just like, is this sustainable in terms of like, where do you go from all of these kind of crazy? So like, I think even, one of the donuts that I had delivered here recently from shout out to Fan Donuts in Brooklyn. They were going through their chocolate donut festival where every donut was like from some inspiration from a different country, right? So that's like perfect for Instagram, right? But I think like I question more from a consumer standpoint, does that kind of continue? How do you kind of like top stuff like that? And then do people continue to like just sort of the regular stuff, but I guess like in new and different ways. So the other place I order from, shout out to Dunwell in Bushwick, is vegan, right? And I think you're going to see a lot of that as well, of like people have different dietary restrictions now. And so I think that will become more popular. But yeah, I think I'm curious more from a ingredients perspective of kind of just like, where do we go from some of these current variations?
Yeah, I mean, I think as long as Big Donut can keep convincing people that there are multiple occasions for which you should have some of these exotic donuts, they will probably continue to do well. Much like the big cake industry has basically co-opted the birthday. There's really no reason for those two things to be intertwined, but they are the birthday cake. So they've kind of survived through many decades and centuries. So we'll see what happens with donuts. I think likely it'll probably just plateau out. Like I don't think it's going to go away, but I think probably what will happen is you just won't see. They made it sound like those guys are probably creating donuts or new donuts like weekly, if not even more frequently, just to sort of keep up with, keep it interesting, keep people almost coming back specifically to see what they're doing. In addition to grabbing their sort of glazed donut, I don't know if I would assume there's probably a markup on those. But I think it'll just kind of come down to as we kind of transition post-pandemic into sort of a new quote-unquote paradigm, will donuts kind of still be one of those things that people just kind of in mass, just kind of like pick up, or will it kind of just be not niche? Donuts are by no means niche, but just sort of like to your point, will people kind of continue to go beyond glazed or just beyond chocolate, beyond whatever? Will they want the like poop emoji thing? Will they want this emoji? Will they want that? Will they want this? Or some of these more complicated things? Because unlike the pizza sort of industry, like it was kind of, I remember when that, especially in New York, where we kind of went from everyone's kind of doing the same thing to all of a sudden everyone was like putting gourmet things on the pizza, and pizza was getting expensive, but you were like, this is actually really good. But then at the end of the day, it's a meal. So you're kind of okay with it. With donuts, it's kind of still this, it's like weird because it's more of a dessert, even though it's sort of like been presented and kind of like indoctrinated as a breakfast sort of food. So it'll just be interesting to see.
How dare you?
How
It
happens.
is definitely breakfast.
Yeah, I mean, it's pure sugar. It's like sugar bread with frosting on it. So it's someone's marketing legacy for that is intact to this day. But there's no
So
reason.
I just have to say, I feel so much better about this quality in myself because another documentary that maybe at some point we'll see. But Stanley Tucci currently has a series on CNN right now where he goes around Italy, and in the first episode, he is just eating all of this sweet breakfast, and they talk at length about the fact that that's a very Italian thing. So, yes, I feel like that is my people. It is normal in Italy to eat sweets, and including donuts. He actually eats this massive donut with like cream pouring out the top. That's the breakfast food. So,
Yeah.
Yeah,
right. Well, until Big Dentist got involved and then told everybody not to. But as I said, I feel like that's very clever marketing in America versus I feel like that's the Italian way of doing things is very, very old, I would assume. Unlike the American way, which is look what I found. Guess what they're doing over in such and such. Oh, okay, let's copy that. Kind of spin it a little bit. Anything else from the Donut King that we didn't get to that you want to talk about?
I just would definitely recommend this one to people. I think
usually I have some sort of caveat of like who I think in particular would like this. I really think anyone would like this documentary, just because, as the stats kind of show, most likely you've eaten a donut before. And I think it'll reveal something about, a food that probably either you've consumed a lot of in your life or at least you're aware of. And I think it's a really great story that's timely, again, as I mentioned, just for certain things and, discussions that we're having as a country right now. I think it's a really great reminder of, some of the great moments we've had as a country where we really do kind of, stand up for what we believe is right and take people in and give people, resource and an opportunity at a better life and really the American dream, right? I think it's cool to see examples of that given the current climate that we're in right now. And so I found it, even though his personal story might have had some very tragic turns, I think overall it was a very optimistic view on, again, America and kind of what's possible here. So I would definitely recommend this one.
Yeah, I would. I'm a little torn on it. I mean, I guess I would recommend it. There's nothing that that I'm necessarily putting a strike on. I just feel like there wasn't. I think by the end of this, the biggest sort of takeaway for me was actually like the stuff that wasn't even related to the donuts. There was like all the stuff that I was talking about earlier about like sort of the immigration piece of it, but just like the thought of, the next time, listeners, that you're just walking through your city or you're visiting in any city and you just kind of happen to see a particular demographic. It's just really fascinating to me. Like makes me really want to think about like dive in a little bit into like the history of, like these like, Little Italy and like Chinatown and all that kind of stuff. Because I think from the outside in, you just kind of go, oh, well, that's just where like immigrants, during that stage of, the country's sort of evolution all kind of congregated, and that's just kind of where they remained. And I'm sure that's where people come in and then they kind of spread out to the US at some point. But it was just fascinating to kind of think that like in arbitrarily, because of this conflict in Cambodia, like they just happened to land in California, and like through one sort of series of just interconnected, unrelated events, Ted finds himself training at a Winchell's, and then it ends up sort of creating this entire culture because of a decision he made. I think that's really fascinating, and that's kind of the part that like I'll definitely take away from this. If that's fascinating to you, I think definitely check it out. Otherwise, I think it's kind of the donut stuff is cool. And like if you're, sort of like how Nicole, if like donuts are definitely very kind of much a part of your life. Like if, you find yourself walking into this shop or that shop or even like Dunkin' or making your own donuts or that kind of thing. It's frosting on the cake. But I think beyond that, it's kind of just, for me personally, I was just more interested in the immigration stuff.
Yeah, I think if that is of interest to you, and then in particular, if you want to understand that from the perspective of food, I would highly recommend Taste the Nation with Padma Lakshmi, because each episode she goes around the U.S. and looks at like areas where, certain populations immigrated and how their food culture then got adopted up into American culture. And it was really fascinating because some of them I knew about, but a lot of them I didn't. I think in particular, I knew, but it's really interesting to see how much German food pervaded American food and how many things that we refer to now like aren't American. So definitely check that out if that's something you want to explore more.
Very cool. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, my fellow feathers and arms, that is episode number 7. As we mentioned up top, if you enjoyed what you heard tonight, help us keep it going by supporting us over at patreon.com/Pandora's Quack. Feel free to share, rate, and review us on the free podcasting service of your choice, and stick around for Pandora's Quack's other upcoming shows. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, listeners. Now, I've realized inadvertently, as I was putting the show together tonight, we have been spending a lot of time in California. Completely unintentional, completely random, completely just, this is how it happened.
I thought you were doing it purposely.
And I was like, man, we need to get out of California. So no longer, listeners, taking a hiatus from the West Coast. We are going east, very east, a little northeast, to a place we like to call Harlem, New York. And that's where we'll begin next week. This podcast was produced by Pandora's Quack. She's Nicole Matthews, and you can follow her at...
You can follow me on Twitter at Nicole Matthews and on Instagram at Marie Coley.
I'm Brandan Jones, and you can follow me on Twitter or Vero at Lamar Diablo. That's one word. And these are the rabbit holes that quack. Good night.